The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead at Cooper's corner store, casting a harsh glow across the nearly empty aisles. It was just another quiet night shift for the young clerk behind the counter, who was absent-mindedly restocking the candy display while keeping an eye on the few late-night customers browsing the shelves. The automatic doors wheezed open at 2 a.m., letting in a gust of chilly air that made everyone look up. What they saw made them stop and stare. An elderly gentleman, probably in his late 70s, stood in the doorway wearing nothing but a thin white t-shirt and an adult diaper. His feet were bare against the cold tile floor, and his silver hair stuck out in all directions like he'd just gotten out of bed. The clerk's heart skipped a beat. In all her years working the night shift, she'd seen some strange things. Drunk college students trying to buy snacks with Monopoly money, a woman who brought her pet iguana shopping, and even a guy who came in wearing a full superhero costume. But this was different. There was something in the old man's eyes that spoke of confusion and fear, like he wasn't quite sure where he was or how he'd gotten there. A couple of teenage boys near the soda fridge started snickering, and a woman in the bread aisle quickly hurried her young children away. But the clerk noticed something else. A hospital bracelet dangling from the man's wrist, the kind they'd put on patients to identify them. She slowly came out from behind the counter, grabbing a clean store apron from under the register as she moved. "Sir," she called out softly, approaching him like you might approach a scared animal. "Are you feeling okay?" The old man's eyes darted around the store, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Up close, she could see goosebumps on his arms from the cold air conditioning. "I'm looking for my daughter's house," he said, his voice surprisingly clear and dignified despite his appearance. "She's expecting me for Sunday dinner." The clerk glanced at the wall calendar behind the counter. It was Wednesday night, not Sunday. She draped the apron around his shoulders like a makeshift blanket, noticing how he instantly grabbed onto it with grateful hands. "Can you tell me your daughter's address?" she asked, leading him gently toward a plastic chair near the counter where they usually let elderly customers rest. Yes, of course," he nodded confidently. "It's 742 Maple Street." The clerk knew every street in their small town. There was no Maple Street anywhere nearby. As she helped him sit down, she caught sight of the name on his hospital bracelet. Harold Thompson, 78 years old. Patient ID #4973. St. Mary's Hospital. Something in her chest tightened. St. Mary's was 6 blocks away, which meant this confused gentleman had walked all that way in the cold, wearing almost nothing, probably passing dozens of cars and people who didn't stop to help. How long had he been wandering the streets? The thought made her angry and sad at the same time. Other customers were still staring, some with phones raised like they might start recording. The clerk positioned herself between them and Mr. Thompson, creating a small barrier of privacy. She could hear him muttering under his breath now, something about needing to grade papers before the school board meeting. Everything about his behavior screamed that this was a man who needed help, not judgment or ridicule. She caught her coworker's eye and made a subtle gesture toward the phone. They'd worked together long enough to have a silent understanding. Call the hospital now. As her coworker slipped into the back office to make the call, she stayed with Mr. Thompson, listening as he drifted between talking about his daughter's cooking and mentioning something about next week's parent-teacher conferences. With each word, another piece of his story emerged, painting a picture of a life now fractured by confusion and illness. The night was about to become much more complicated than anyone in that store could have imagined, and none of them knew yet how this unexpected encounter would change not just one life, but an entire community. The store's night clerk couldn't ignore the whispers and stares from other customers as she stood protectively near Mr. Thompson. A young mother quickly ushered her children toward the exit, while 2 college students pretended to be deeply interested in the chip display, sneaking glances every few seconds. The old man seemed oblivious to the attention, his fingers fidgeting with the store apron wrapped around his shoulders. "Would you like some water?" the clerk asked gently, noticing how dry his lips looked. When he nodded, she grabbed a bottle from the cooler, uncapped it, and handed it to him. His hands shook so badly that some water spilled down his chin, but he managed to take a few sips. The simple act of drinking seemed to bring him more into the present moment. Looking closer at his hospital bracelet, she noticed something that made her heart sink. The admission date was just yesterday. This wasn't someone who had been in long-term care. This was a man whose world had probably turned upside down in the past 48 hours. She thought about her own grandfather and how scared he would be in this situation. A truck driver who had been browsing the coffee aisle approached the counter, his face etched with concern. "My dad had dementia," he said quietly to the clerk. "Want me to stick around until help arrives?" She nodded gratefully, appreciating how some people could still show kindness instead of judgment. The truck driver pulled up another plastic chair and sat nearby, not too close to overwhelm Mr. Thompson, but close enough to help if needed. Mr. Thompson suddenly became agitated, trying to stand up. "I need to get home," he insisted, his voice rising with anxiety. "The school board meeting starts in an hour, and I haven't finished my presentation." The clerk gently placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling his muscles trembling beneath the thin t-shirt. "Let's wait just a few minutes," she suggested, keeping her voice calm and steady. "We can make sure you have everything you need for the presentation first." It was a small lie, but one meant to keep him safe. She'd learned from experience that arguing with someone who was confused often made things worse. Her coworker returned from the back office with news. The hospital had been contacted and confirmed that Mr. Thompson was indeed their missing patient. They'd already called his family, who were frantically searching the neighborhood. The relief in knowing help was coming mixed with worry about how to keep him comfortable and calm until then. The truck driver started talking softly about his own father's teaching days, somehow sensing that Mr. Thompson had been an educator. It worked like magic. The elderly man's eyes lit up, and he began sharing stories about his own classroom experiences. Through his scattered memories, glimpses of the person he used to be shown through. A dedicated principal who knew every student's name, who started a scholarship fund for underprivileged kids, who never missed a school play or sports event. Other customers in the store had stopped pretending to shop and were listening to his stories, their earlier judgment replaced by something softer, more understanding. A teenager who had been snickering earlier now looked ashamed, shuffling his feet and avoiding eye contact with anyone. The clock ticked past 2:30 a.m., and the store's fluorescent lights felt less harsh somehow, as if the shared humanity of the moment had softened their glare. The night clerk kept glancing at the automatic doors, waiting for help to arrive, while making sure Mr. Thompson stayed hydrated and as comfortable as possible in his makeshift covering. What started as a potentially frightening or embarrassing situation had transformed into something else entirely. A reminder that behind every confused elderly person is a lifetime of experiences, achievements, and dignity that deserves to be protected. The small group of late-night shoppers who had witnessed this scene would carry it with them long after they left the store, perhaps thinking differently the next time they encountered someone who seemed lost or vulnerable. While waiting for help to arrive, the night clerk decided to try learning more about Mr. Thompson's family. Maybe it would help keep him calm and give them useful information at the same time. "You mentioned your daughter earlier," she said softly. "Could you tell me about her?" Mr. Thompson's face lit up immediately. "My Margaret," he said, his voice full of pride. "She's a wonderful cook, you know. Makes the best apple pie in town." He paused, looking around the store as if seeing it for the first time. "I'm supposed to be at her house for dinner. She's making pot roast tonight." The truck driver, still sitting nearby, nodded encouragingly. "Pot roast sounds delicious. Is that your favorite meal?" This simple question opened a floodgate of memories for Mr. Thompson, who began sharing stories about Sunday family dinners and holiday gatherings. Through his stories, a picture emerged of a close-knit family. He spoke about Margaret's childhood, how she'd won the spelling bee in 4th grade, and how she'd followed in his footsteps to become a teacher herself. But then his story started jumping around in time. Sometimes Margaret was a little girl. Sometimes she was grown up with her own children. "I need to call her," he suddenly announced, patting his pockets frantically. "She'll be worried. I always call when I'm running late." His agitation began to build again, and the clerk could see tears forming in his eyes. The reality of his situation, standing in a store in the middle of the night, wearing only a hospital gown and diaper, seemed to hit him for a moment. The clerk thought quickly. "Why don't you tell me her number? I can call her from the store phone." It was a gentle deflection, but it gave him something to focus on. Mr. Thompson recited a phone number perfectly, then another, each one different, each one said with absolute certainty. The clerk pretended to write them all down, nodding supportively. A young woman who had been quietly shopping in the store approached them, carrying a pack of new socks she'd just taken off the shelf. "My grandfather had Alzheimer's," she said quietly to the clerk. "Maybe these would help. The floor must be cold." The clerk gratefully accepted the socks, touched by the small act of kindness from a stranger. As they helped Mr. Thompson put on the socks, he started talking about his wife. "Betty always made sure I had warm socks," he said softly. "She knew I got cold feet at night." His voice cracked slightly. "She's late tonight, too. Usually home by now." The clerk and the young woman exchanged glances, understanding from his earlier stories that Betty had passed away years ago. The truck driver smoothly changed the subject, asking about Mr. Thompson's years as a principal. This sparked a more coherent conversation about education and his passion for helping students. Even in his confused state, his face became animated when talking about teaching, and his words carried the weight of decades of experience. Other customers who had been lingering in the store began sharing their own school memories, creating a gentle bubble of conversation around Mr. Thompson. The late-night atmosphere had transformed into something almost intimate, like a gathering of friends rather than strangers in a convenience store. One elderly customer mentioned attending the local high school 30 years ago. The principal back then really cared about the students, she said. Mr. Thompson turned to her with sudden clarity in his eyes. "Were you in Mrs. Patterson's English class?" he asked. "Second floor, room 237. The woman's jaw dropped. He had remembered correctly, even through his confusion. This moment of lucidity seemed to exhaust him, though, and he began to slump in his chair. The clerk adjusted the apron around his shoulders while the truck driver quietly went to get another bottle of water. They could all see that Mr. Thompson was getting tired, but they knew the hospital staff would arrive soon. Until then, this impromptu community of late-night shoppers stayed close by, each one contributing in their own way to keeping him safe and comfortable. While her coworker kept watch over the front of the store, the night clerk stepped into the back office to speak with the hospital staff on the phone again. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she quietly closed the door, not wanting Mr. Thompson to overhear the conversation and become upset. "He just walked out," she whispered into the phone, trying to keep her voice steady despite her growing concern. The nurse on the other end sounded exhausted and genuinely worried. She explained that Mr. Thompson had been admitted yesterday for evaluation after his daughter found him cooking dinner at 3 a.m. and leaving the stove on. During the evening shift change, somehow, he had managed to slip out unnoticed. The clerk's hand tightened around the phone as she learned more details. The hospital had already called the police, and Mr. Thompson's daughter was driving around the neighborhood searching frantically. "He's safe here," the clerk assured them. "We're keeping him comfortable and calm." She gave them the store's address and detailed directions, knowing every minute mattered to a worried family. As she hung up the phone, she noticed her hands were shaking slightly. Her own grandfather had passed away last year, and something about Mr. Thompson reminded her of him. The same gentle dignity, even when confused. Taking a deep breath, she stepped back into the store. The scene that greeted her brought an unexpected lump to her throat. The small group of customers had created a protective circle around Mr. Thompson. The truck driver was showing him pictures of his own father's teaching days on his phone, while the young woman who had bought the socks was holding a quiet conversation with him about classic cars. Apparently, she had noticed him mentioning his old Chevrolet earlier. Even the teenage boys who had been snickering earlier had moved closer, their initial amusement replaced by concern. One of them had gone to his car and brought back a blanket, which now lay across Mr. Thompson's lap along with the store apron. It was a simple gesture that spoke volumes about how quickly compassion can replace judgment. The clerk's coworker pulled her aside to share some news. He had checked the security cameras and traced Mr. Thompson's approach to the store. The footage showed him walking unsteadily down the street, passing several cars that just drove by. Some pedestrians had crossed to the other side of the street to avoid him. The thought of him walking 6 blocks in the cold, confused and alone, made both employees share a moment of silent anger at how people could be so indifferent. Looking at the time stamps on the security footage revealed something else. Mr. Thompson had been wandering for almost 2 hours before reaching the store. 2 hours in which anything could have happened to him. 2 hours where he was just another invisible person that people chose not to see. The clerk returned to the group, noticing how Mr. Thompson's eyelids were getting heavy. The earlier burst of energy from sharing his stories had faded, leaving him looking fragile and tired. She knelt beside his chair, speaking softly. "Help is on the way," she told him. "Your daughter is coming to get you." His eyes focused on her for a moment with surprising clarity. "Margaret?" he asked, hope clear in his voice. "Yes," she assured him. "Margaret is coming." He smiled slightly, then looked down at himself as if suddenly aware of his state of dress. A flash of shame crossed his face. The truck driver, noticing this moment of awareness, smoothly started talking about school basketball games, drawing Mr. Thompson back into conversation. It was amazing how this group of strangers had learned to read his moods and redirect his attention when needed, each person playing their part in this unexpected late-night drama. Through the store's front windows, they could see more cars than usual driving slowly past, their headlights sweeping the parking lot. They knew that somewhere out there, a daughter was desperately searching for her father, and hospital staff were trying to understand how this could have happened. Soon, this strange, gentle bubble of community that had formed in the store would burst, but until then, they would continue their quiet vigil. The store's automatic doors slid open with a familiar whoosh, and a woman in her mid-40s rushed in, her eyes scanning the space frantically. The moment she saw Mr. Thompson, her face crumpled with relief and worry all at once. "Dad," she called out, hurrying toward him. This had to be Margaret. Mr. Thompson looked up at the sound of her voice, and his face brightened with recognition. "Margaret, you're late for dinner," he said matter-of-factly, as if he weren't sitting in a convenience store in the middle of the night wearing just a hospital gown and diaper. Margaret knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers, tears streaming down her face. "I've been so worried, Dad," she whispered, her voice catching. "We've been looking everywhere for you." She looked up at the small group of people gathered around her father, gratitude shining in her eyes. The clerk quietly explained how they'd been keeping him comfortable and safe. As Margaret wrapped her arms around her father, the truck driver stepped back, giving them space for their reunion. The young woman who had bought the socks discreetly wiped her eyes, and even the teenage boys looked away, suddenly finding the snack aisle incredibly interesting. Margaret began gently explaining to her father that they needed to go back to the hospital, but Mr. Thompson's face clouded with confusion. "But I have to grade papers," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "The school board meeting is tomorrow." The change in his demeanor was immediate, from calm to agitated in seconds. Seeing his distress, Margaret changed tactics. "How about we stop by the house first?" she suggested softly. "You can check your briefcase." The clerk watched in admiration as Margaret navigated her father's confusion with practiced patience, despite her own obvious exhaustion. While they waited for the hospital transport to arrive, Margaret shared more of their story with the small group that had become her father's temporary guardians. 3 months ago, she explained, she'd started noticing small changes. Her father, who had always been sharp as a tack, began forgetting little things, where he put his keys, what day it was, whether he'd eaten lunch. He was such an amazing principal, she said, her voice full of pride and sadness. He knew every student's name, their parents' names, their siblings' names. He never forgot a face. She glanced at her father, who was now dozing lightly in his chair. Last week, he couldn't remember my daughter's name. His own granddaughter. The young woman who had bought the socks shared that her grandfather had gone through something similar. It's like watching them disappear in pieces, she said quietly, and Margaret nodded, fresh tears welling up in her eyes. The clerk's coworker brought over a cup of hot tea for Margaret, who accepted it with trembling hands. She hadn't slept since her father went missing, had been driving around town for hours, checking all his old haunts. The school where he used to work, the park where he used to take his grandchildren, the library where he had volunteered after retirement. I knew something was really wrong when I found him cooking at 3 a.m. last week, she continued. The stove was on, but there was no food in the pans. When I asked what he was making, he said he was preparing lunch for a staff meeting. He hasn't worked at the school for 10 years. Mr. Thompson stirred in his chair, opening his eyes. Margaret? He said, sounding surprisingly clear. I'm sorry I worried you. For a moment, he seemed to fully understand where he was and what had happened. Margaret squeezed his hand, telling him it was okay, but everyone could see the pain in her eyes at these brief moments of lucidity that came and went like summer rain. Through the store windows, they could see the hospital transport pulling into the parking lot. The late-night adventure was coming to an end, but for Margaret and her father, it was just another step in a longer journey that no one could have prepared them for. As they waited for the hospital transport team to enter the store, Mr. Thompson had one of those remarkable moments of clarity that sometimes pierce through the fog of confusion. He looked around at the small group of people who had gathered to help him, his eyes suddenly sharp and alert. I remember teaching kids like all of you, he said, his voice stronger than it had been all night. 30 years in education, never missed a day. He turned to his daughter. Remember when you were little, Margaret? You used to come to my office after school, do your homework at that little desk I put in the corner. Margaret squeezed his hand, surprised by this sudden return of his old self. The truck driver leaned forward, genuinely interested. What made you want to become a principal? He asked gently, sensing this was a special moment worth exploring. Mr. Thompson sat up straighter in his chair, the store apron still draped around his shoulders. I grew up poor, he began. My father worked 2 jobs, but we barely had enough for school supplies. My high school principal noticed I was using the same pencil stub for weeks. One day, he called me to his office. I thought I was in trouble. He paused, smiling at the memory. Instead, he gave me a whole box of pencils and notebooks. Said he saw potential in me. That changed everything. Knowing someone believed in me. His eyes grew distant. After that, I worked harder than ever. Got a scholarship to college, became a teacher, then a principal. Wanted to be that person for other kids. The teenage boys who had been listening nearby shifted uncomfortably, perhaps thinking about their earlier laughter when Mr. Thompson first entered the store. One of them spoke up hesitantly. Did you help other kids too? Like your principal helped you. Every chance I got, Mr. Thompson replied. Started a supply closet at school. Any kid who needed notebooks, pencils, backpacks, they could just come and take what they needed. No questions asked. He looked at Margaret. Your mother used to help me stock it. She'd buy extra supplies every August when the sales started. The mention of his late wife didn't bring confusion this time, but rather a gentle sadness. Betty was a wonder with the kids. She baked cookies for every faculty meeting, knew every secretary's birthday. After she passed, he paused, his voice catching. Well, the school didn't feel quite the same. The night clerk noticed Margaret wiping away tears. This was clearly a side of her father she hadn't seen clearly in months. The strong, caring educator who had touched so many lives. The young woman who had bought the socks was listening intently, her own eyes glistening. We started a scholarship fund, he continued, his words coming faster now, as if he knew this moment of clarity might not last. For kids like I was. Kids who needed a chance. Is that still going, Margaret? His daughter nodded. Yes, Dad. The Thompson Education Fund. It's helped over 50 students go to college. The store's fluorescent lights seemed to soften as Mr. Thompson shared more stories. About students he'd helped, teachers he'd mentored, parents he'd counseled through difficult times. Even in his hospital gown and makeshift blanket, he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime in service to others. But then, as quickly as it had come, the clarity began to fade. His words started to jumble, past and present mixing together. He looked around the store with growing confusion, the certainty in his voice replaced by questioning. Is it time for the staff meeting? He asked Margaret, his earlier confidence slipping away. The small group of late-night observers watched this transformation with heavy hearts, understanding they had witnessed something precious. A brief window into the man Mr. Thompson used to be, the life he had lived, and the difference he had made in countless lives. As the hospital transport team finally walked through the doors, they weren't just seeing a confused elderly man in a diaper anymore, but rather a dedicated educator, a loving father, and a community leader who had shaped generations of students. News travels fast in a small town, and by the next morning, the story of what happened at Cooper's corner store had spread through the community like wildfire. It wasn't just the strange sight of an elderly man in a diaper that caught people's attention. It was how a group of strangers had come together to protect someone's dignity in their moment of vulnerability. The young woman who had bought the socks shared her experience on the local community Facebook page, not to gossip, but to remind people about checking on their elderly neighbors. She didn't mention Mr. Thompson by name, but she described how a confused former educator had touched the hearts of everyone in that store. Her post struck a chord. Comments began pouring in from former students who suddenly realized the confused man in the store was their beloved principal. Mr. T gave me my first calculator when my family couldn't afford one, wrote one commenter. He noticed I was struggling in math class and just handed it to me one day, said it was extra school supplies. Another person shared how he had been a troubled teen, constantly in fights, until Mr. Thompson took him under his wing. Instead of suspending me, he made me help tutor younger kids after school. Changed my whole life. I became a teacher because of him. The truck driver who had stayed with Mr. Thompson that night shared his own story at his next stop. Soon, truckers at the local diner were talking about how they could help keep an eye out for wandering elderly folks during their late-night routes. One of them suggested creating a network of drivers who could alert each other if they spotted someone who seemed lost or confused. The teenage boys who had initially laughed at Mr. Thompson showed up at the hospital the next day. They brought a hand-drawn card and asked to speak with Margaret. Looking embarrassed but determined, they apologized for their behavior and asked if there was anything they could do to help. Margaret, touched by their gesture, suggested they might want to volunteer at the senior center. Word reached the current principal of Mr. Thompson's old school. She remembered him as the one who had hired her for her first teaching job 20 years ago. After hearing about the incident, she called an emergency staff meeting. By the end of the day, the school had launched a new initiative, the Thompson Watch program, where students and teachers would take turns visiting local nursing homes and spending time with elderly residents. The night clerk who had first helped Mr. Thompson noticed something changing in the store too. Customers who had heard the story started leaving extra money at the register, asking that it be used to help anyone else who might wander and needing assistance. A local clothing store donated a box of emergency clothing to keep at Cooper's corner, just in case. Margaret was overwhelmed by the community's response. People she hadn't seen in years reached out, offering to help with hospital visits or simply sharing stories about how her father had impacted their lives. Each story was like a piece of a puzzle, helping her see the fuller picture of the man her father had been, the man who still existed somewhere behind the confusion. Even the hospital made changes. The story of how Mr. Thompson had managed to walk 6 blocks unnoticed sparked a review of their security protocols. But more than that, it reminded the staff that each confused patient in their care was someone's father, mother, teacher, or friend. Someone who had lived a full life and deserved to be treated with respect. The local paper ran a small article about the incident, focusing not on the embarrassing circumstances, but on how a community had come together to help one of their own. The reporter interviewed the truck driver, who summed it up simply. Sometimes it takes seeing someone at their most vulnerable to remember our own humanity. What could have been just another strange late-night incident had transformed into something much more meaningful. A wake-up call for a community to look out for its elderly members, to remember the people they used to be, and to treat them with the dignity they deserve. In the weeks following the incident at Cooper's Corner Store, the changes at St. Mary's Hospital were both immediate and far-reaching. The night shift supervisor called an all-staff meeting to discuss what had happened. "We were lucky," she told her team, her voice heavy with concern. "Mr. Thompson made it to that store safely, but things could have gone very differently." The hospital administration took a hard look at their security measures. They installed new door alarms and security cameras, but more importantly, they changed how they handled patient monitoring. Every staff member, from doctors to cleaning crews, received special training on watching for wandering patients and responding to confusion with compassion. The head nurse created a new system called the Dignity Watch Protocol. Each patient with memory issues now wore a special bracelet that would alert staff if they got too close to exit doors. But it wasn't just about keeping people in. It was about keeping them comfortable and engaged, especially during the challenging night hours when confusion often worsened. Back at Cooper's Corner Store, the night clerk noticed something interesting. The teenage boys who had laughed at Mr. Thompson now stopped by regularly during her shift. They weren't there to buy snacks anymore. Instead, they'd check if anyone needed help getting to their car safely, especially elderly customers. One of them admitted that he couldn't stop thinking about how his own grandfather might have been treated in a similar situation. The store manager made some changes too. He set aside a small emergency care cabinet near the front counter, stocked with basic supplies, clean clothes in various sizes, blankets, water bottles, and simple snacks. "You never know who might walk through those doors needing help," he said during a staff meeting. The night clerk felt proud knowing that her handling of the situation had helped create this new safety net. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's, they started offering free monthly workshops for families caring for loved ones with memory problems. Margaret attended the first session, sharing her story with other families who were just beginning this difficult journey. "I used to get frustrated when Dad would get confused," she admitted to the group. "But now I try to remember him as the principal who changed so many lives. It helps me be more patient." The hospital also partnered with local police to create a rapid response system for missing elderly patients. They set up a special hotline and trained officers on how to approach and assist confused seniors they might encounter during their patrols. The police chief had been particularly moved by the image of Mr. Thompson walking those 6 blocks alone in the cold. One of the most significant changes came from the hospital's approach to shift changes, the time when Mr. Thompson had managed to slip away. Instead of the usual quick handover, they now had a 15-minute overlap where both shifts worked together, doing detailed patient checks. They called it the Thompson Protocol, and it quickly became standard practice at other hospitals in the region. The truck driver who had stayed with Mr. Thompson that night spoke at one of the hospital's training sessions, describing how simple kindness and patience had helped keep a confused elderly man calm and safe. "Sometimes you don't need special training," he told the staff. "You just need to remember that could be your own parent or grandparent sitting there, scared and confused. Local businesses near the hospital started putting up small signs in their windows, a blue dot that meant their staff had been trained to help confused elderly people who might wander in. Cooper's Corner Store had the first blue dot, and within a month, more than 30 other businesses had joined what people were calling the Blue Dot Network. The night clerk kept the store's security footage from that night, not because of hospital policy or legal requirements, but as a reminder. Sometimes, during quiet moments in her shift, she would think about how a potentially frightening situation had transformed into a moment of community care. The image of strangers coming together to protect one confused elderly man's dignity had become a powerful symbol of how a community should treat its most vulnerable members. 1 year after that memorable night at Cooper's Corner Store, Margaret sat in a comfortable chair at Sunrise Memory Care Center, holding her father's hand. Mr. Thompson had moved into the facility 6 months ago when his care needs became too complex for home management. The center's walls were painted in warm colors, and large windows let in plenty of natural light, a far cry from the harsh fluorescent lighting of that convenience store a year ago. The facility's common room had become a gathering place not just for residents, but for community members too. Those same teenage boys who had once laughed at Mr. Thompson now visited regularly as part of their school's community service program. Today, one of them was teaching Mr. Thompson how to play chess, showing remarkable patience as he explained the same moves multiple times. The night clerk from Cooper's Corner still thought about that evening whenever she worked the late shift. She developed a kind of sixth sense for spotting people who might need help, and the store's emergency care cabinet had been used more times than anyone expected. Last week, she'd helped a confused elderly woman who had wandered in looking for her childhood home. Thanks to the Blue Dot Network and the Thompson Protocol, getting help was now just a phone call away. Margaret often reflected on how that frightening night had sparked so many positive changes. The Thompson Watch program at her father's old school had spread to other districts, with students regularly visiting senior centers and retirement homes. The scholarship fund her father had started saw a surge in donations after his story spread, and this year it would help 10 students attend college. The truck driver who had stayed with them that night had become an advocate for elderly care awareness among his fellow drivers. He'd helped create a network of truckers who kept watch during their late-night routes, and several lost seniors had been found safely thanks to their vigilance. Every time he passed Cooper's Corner Store on his route, he'd stop in just to check if anyone needed help. Mr. Thompson's condition had progressed, and he now had more bad days than good. But even in his confusion, glimpses of the caring educator he'd been still shone through. Sometimes he'd try to help other residents with their homework or ask about upcoming parent-teacher conferences. The staff learned to work with these moments rather than against them, creating activities that gave him a sense of purpose. The young woman who had bought those socks a year ago now worked at Sunrise as an activities coordinator. She'd been so moved by that night that she'd changed careers, wanting to work with memory care residents. She made sure every new resident had warm, comfortable socks, a small gesture that had grown from her first act of kindness toward Mr. Thompson. Local medical students now did rotations at Sunrise, learning not just about dementia care, but about the importance of seeing the person behind the diagnosis. They heard the story of the night at Cooper's Corner Store during their orientation, not as a cautionary tale about wandering patients, but as a reminder of how communities can come together to protect their vulnerable members. Margaret had started a support group for families dealing with memory loss, meeting in the hospital's new Family Resource Center. They shared stories, advice, and sometimes just quiet understanding. My father's confusion took him away from me bit by bit, she often told new members, but it also showed me how much good still exists in the world. On this particular afternoon, Mr. Thompson was having one of his clearer moments. Looking around the common room, he squeezed his daughter's hand. "We did good, didn't we?" he asked softly, perhaps remembering his years of service to the community, or perhaps simply feeling the warmth of the present moment. Margaret smiled, tears in her eyes. Yes, Dad, she whispered. You did so much good. That strange night at Cooper's corner store had begun with an elderly man walking in wearing just a diaper, but it had grown into something much larger. A reminder that every person, no matter their condition, deserves to be treated with dignity, and that sometimes the most unexpected moments can bring out the best in a community.